In the summer, we're going to take kids to camp. And so camp is an amazing ministry. When I was just a young kid, a teenager, junior high, I was in high school at the time, so I was cool like all these kids that didn't want to come up here. I was sitting in a camp service, and God used the speaker that week. Pastor Stanton was his name, Staten, excuse me. And God really got a hold of my heart. And at camp, I surrendered my life to God and to ministry. And I made that decision, of course, as a result of godly parents who love me and love Jesus and raised me to follow Jesus. But it was as a result of being at camp that decision was made. So this summer, we want to send not only these kids, but we want to send other kids to go to camp. Camp is an amazing week. They get away from the world. They get away from all their electronics for a week, and they focus on God. It's really cool. There's great music, games, all those kind of things. So next Sunday, we're going to help send these kids to camp, and we're going to have a camp bake sale. Now, what that means, we're going to have you bake cakes. You're going to bring them, cakes or pies or cookies or whatever. You're going to bring them next week. And then at the end of the service, we're going to transform this room, and we're going to have lunch together, and then we are going to have an auction. We're going to auction off those cakes. And we're asking every family to pray about how much you will buy a cake for next Sunday. And I'm going to talk more about this at the end of the service. But I want you to understand something about when we're buying these cakes. And you're going to hear cakes going for $100, $200, $300, hopefully $1,000, whatever. You're not buying just a cake. You're really investing in the lives of young people to take them to camp. What I would love to be able to do is to say, hey, if Ainsley has a friend at school that doesn't know Jesus, how awesome would it be if we could tell Ainsley, hey, Ainsley, I want you to invite one friend to come to camp, and we're going to pay their way. And then that way that kid can go to camp, hear about Jesus, make a decision that maybe like me, change my life forever, change my life for the better. And so next Sunday we're going to do that. And the executive decision that I've made is only the kids up front today are going to be able to get any of the benefits of the camp bake sale next week. So, no, just kidding. We're going to let the two cool junior high and high school students have a share of the pie, no pun intended. They're going to have their piece of the pie, but kids, junior high and high school, you can't have your cake and eat it too, all right? All right, that's all the jokes I have. So, next Sunday, camp bake sale. I'll talk to you more about that at the end of the service. All right, kids, camp, cool? All right, now follow your leader, Jeremy. Let's all pray for Jeremy as they go out. And then junior high and high school students, you can go at this point as well. Hey, babe, did you bring that? Okay, all right. So I have this thing that you need to know about me. I'm kind of weird, and I don't like messy things. So when Leslie and I were thinking about having children, we didn't have any children at the time. I loved kids, but I hate picking up a baby. I hated picking up a baby and the baby smelled like ketchup and throw up. You know what I'm saying? You know? Like, or they have their little bib on, and there are just colors on there that you'll never find in a 128 pack of crayons, you know? Like, what in the world did you eat that created that, you know? So I made this determination that when we finally were able to have children, that every time someone picked up my baby was going to smell like baby lotion. And you know that smell? It's like the best. It's like heaven. I think that's what clouds are made of. It's just Johnson baby oil up there, you know, but just kind of in fluffy form. And so I had this dream in my mind that that's what it was going to be like. And so when we found out we were pregnant, and then we started having baby showers, and all these people kept giving us like spit up rags. I'm like, oh, our baby's not going to need that. All right? Because the moment the baby throws up, there's a bath coming, there's rub down with baby oil. Anytime they have a dirty diaper, it's going to be a full bath. You know what I'm saying? Because if Jesse picks up my baby, I don't want him to say, oh, look how cute Luke is. Oh, my goodness, he stinks. You know what I'm saying? So I had this thing about messy things. And so, of course, once we had a kid, I realized that even though we had received 100 burp rags, there weren't enough. You could not keep them washed, quickly enough. And so I gave up that dream that my baby was always going to be clean. I just have this thing about messy things. And then came therapy when Luke got to the age where he could start feeding himself. I'm not kidding you, man. It was therapy every meal, but especially at Taco Cabana. Now, Luke developed a love for chips and cheese early on that has continued now into his 10th year. But as a baby, let's say, well, let's go to Taco Cabana. And Luke learned it very quickly that was a restaurant that he liked. And I'm not kidding you, man. I had to look away. I could not watch the child eat the chips and cheese because he dipped the chip in the cheese, and I mean, it would be all over the table. It would be in his lap. It'd be all over his pants and his hair. It was disgusting, man. And I'm thinking, if anybody picks up this baby, they're not going to smell like baby lotion. It's going to smell like chips and cheese and Rotel, and it's just not good, you know. And so I just had this thing because I don't like messy things. I don't like my hands to be dirty. I don't like my car to get all crazy. But isn't it true that in life, even though you may not, how many of you don't like messy things? Just raise your hand. But how many of you drive yourself crazy because you make a mess? You ever done that? Like, I hate a messy car, but then I look at my car and I'm like, it's a mess. What is the deal, you know? And so I began, as I started thinking about this series about forgiveness that we started last Sunday morning, I began to think about a word that I might use to describe forgiveness. And I could only come up with one word. It's messy. Forgiveness is a mess. I mean, it's just messy. We like things in our lives to kind of be packaged and with a nice bow. I remember when I was in the training academy for the fire department, they came in and they presented us with the insurance packet, and they have a nice folder and all the papers are tucked in, and they're kind of, you know, they're cut at different sizes so you can see the different tabs. And I thought, now this is nice, but have you ever been on the phone with your insurance company? They don't operate in that way. You know, it doesn't, and everything's not organized. It's a mess. There are things in life that are messy, but I can tell you, you'll not find anything messier than forgiveness. And by the end of the series, and I hope that you'll come back, and if you don't live in the city, that you'll listen to these messages online. I want you to understand right up front that if you want this to be nice and clean and all the bows to look perfect and placed under your tree and all the gifts wrapped nicely, and then you forgive and move on and everything's the way that it was, I'm telling you right now, you're living in a pipe dream. Forgiveness is messy. It's dirty. It's unfair. It's unjust. Things will not always go back to the way they were even after you've forgiven. Even if you forgive someone, there still may be consequences. Your relationships with people that either forgave you or you have forgiven, those relationships may change. You're going to get hurt. There are going to be things that are done to you that are unfair. And you're going to feel like you got walked upon. You were abandoned. You were treated poorly. Forgiveness goes against human nature. It's just messy. It's actually against our nature to forgive someone. Instead, we want to hold grudges. We want to hold things against them. But you just need to know and get this in your mind right now that even with all the teaching we're going to do on forgiveness, at the end of the day, it's messy. Okay? So can we all just get on that page and agree for a moment? And you might think, well, I don't know that I necessarily agree. I'm going to show you how messy it can really be. And in fact, we're going to begin today in the book of Genesis. We're going to study the story of a man named Joseph. And let me tell you the reason why forgiveness is messy. And you need to hear this. Forgiveness is messy because forgiveness starts with a hurt. Forgiveness starts with someone offending you. Forgiveness starts with an offense. And that's the nature of forgiveness. If you're sitting here and thinking in your mind or in your heart, there's probably someone that I need to forgive, the reason that you haven't forgiven up to this point is because there's an offense that in your mind is too great to overcome. And you say, I can forgive a lot of things, but that's just one thing I can't forgive. You ever said that? You ever thought that? When I do premarital counseling with couples, I always ask them a question in the course of our conversation. What's one thing that your spouse could do to you in marriage that you feel like is unforgivable? And almost 10 times out of 10 they say, if my spouse was unfaithful. If they had an affair, if they were unfaithful to me, I just don't think that I could forgive that. So we all have different rules. We all have different lines that we'll go to. But in our minds we say there are just some things that are unforgivable. There are just some things that I would not be able to let go and get past. The very fact that either you need to be forgiven by someone or to forgive someone else means that there's a hurt, there's an injustice, there's an offense somewhere in your life. So forgiveness starts dirty. And it stays messy. And it's not easy. Last week on Easter Sunday, I began this series, and I told you last week, if you missed it, that the power to forgive lies in the power of the cross. Jesus on the cross is where the power to forgive begins. So you need to understand that. Follower of Jesus or not, wherever you are, you need to know that Jesus on the cross is the greatest symbol of forgiveness to the world. The perfect Son of God dying in the place of guilty people. And on the cross, the first thing He uttered was what? Father, forgive them. Extend forgiveness to them. At this cross is where we find the power to forgive. But isn't the cross messy? Why did Jesus go to the cross? Somebody give me that answer. Because of what? Our sin. Our offense against Jesus, the perfect Son of God, is the reason the cross even had to happen. Jesus came to earth and He was born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, lived a perfect life, and died on the cross. Why? Because you messed up. He died for you. Do you see that forgiveness is going to be messy? And the power to forgive begins there at the cross. So with this in mind, the fact that forgiveness is messy, I want us for the next 2 weeks to study the story of a man named Joseph. And then at the end of this series, we're going to come back to him. But I want us to begin in Genesis chapter 37 in verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph. Israel is Joseph's father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they what? They hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now, if you don't know Joseph's story, just by those 2 verses, do you see where this story's going? You see it? It's probably because at some point in your life you've experienced favoritism and jealousy. So, growing up, I had 3 siblings. I had 2 older brothers and then a younger sister. Casey was the apple of my dad's eye. So let me give you a little bit about this. My sister, this was in the days before we wore seatbelts. You know, these young folk today, they don't know nothing about them seatbelts. When I grew up, we just sat up in the back of the car. You know, that's what older people say, right? The younger people, these kids today, they don't know nothing about it. My sister would stand beside my dad in the middle seat of his truck and put her hand around him while he would drive her places, and she would curl his hair with her finger. And if any of the boys were jealous and tried to sit in the middle seat, you would face the wrath of Casey. So, of course, being the loving, godly older brothers that we were, we developed what we would call names of endearment for Casey. So it first started as Princess. We called her Princess. So anytime Casey would do something, then Tattletale would go tell on us. That's what we called her also. She would go tell on us. We would all get in trouble and say, oh, Princess went and told Mom and Dad. Well, then some other things happened. And anytime there was an event where Casey was shown favoritism, we would add a word to her title. So one time we were eating cheese puffs, but there weren't enough for everyone. So guess who got them? Casey. So we called her Princess Puff from that point forward. Just add the puff to it. All right. And then we thought, well, that's kind of cool. Princess Puff. And then we started adding every P word that we could. You know, perfect Princess Puff, right? Powder Princess Puff. I mean, any word with P, we're like, oh, add it to it. And by the end of it, you know, and so at the end, we'd be like, powder, perfect Princess Puff. And she would get so mad, and of course, go tell, and then we would get a pow pow. So then we would add that. Perfect powder, Princess Puff, pow pow. You know, that's the way we lived in our house. And so I can understand how Joseph's brothers feel here. Joseph is the favorite. Israel loved his son, Joseph. And the brothers, when they saw how much their father loved their brother, they got jealous. Now, they didn't make up names for him. In fact, as we're going to see, it went even worse. But I want you to look at those verses for just a moment on the screen. And I want you to read them again, and I want you to ask yourself this question. This is an important question. How many of the things in that verse is Joseph responsible for? Was Joseph responsible for how his father felt about him? I mean, is Joseph to be blamed for that? Was Joseph in control of his father's age when he was born? Is it Joseph's fault that Joseph was the child of Israel when Israel was a very old man? Is that Joseph's fault? No. Was it Joseph's fault that his father gave him a gift, that special coat of many colors? Not his fault. Is Joseph responsible for his brother's thoughts or feelings toward him? No. When I tell you that forgiveness is messy, it's because it is so frustrating that you cannot control the words, thoughts, and actions of other people. You may go to someone and ask for forgiveness, and they may not forgive you. In fact, there may be people that hold things against you that are beyond your control. That's the case in this story. It's not Joseph's fault that his dad loved him so much, he had him when he was old, gave him this coat, and his brothers were envious. None of those things are Joseph's fault. But one of the most frustrating parts of life is that we cannot control the words, thoughts, and actions of other people. So many of the factors in these two verses that are working against Joseph are completely beyond his control. And sometimes there are offenses in our lives that are simply beyond our control. If you're the victim of abuse, it's not your fault. Sometimes a spouse walks out on us, and we're left to wonder what happened. Factors that were beyond your control. A friend stabs you in the back. People treat you poorly. Someone violates your confidence. You shared something with them only to find it plastered all over Facebook. Someone deceives you. Someone misguides you. You've been cheated by a business partner. Maybe you got fired unjustly. You were accused unjustly. And on and on and on the things and offenses can go in our lives. All the hurts. And sometimes the offenses that we face that we need to either be forgiven for, or the offenses that we need to forgive someone else for, are things that are beyond our control. But Joseph's difficulty is about to get deeper, because God steps in and God doesn't help. In fact, if you look at verses 7 through 9, Joseph had two dreams. And God gave him these dreams, and he shared them with his brothers. And I'll summarize them. He said, we were out binding sheaves of wheat, and each of us had, one bundle. And all of the 11, they bowed down to mine. So he's telling this to his brothers who already hate him because Dad gave him the coat. He's like, hey, God gave me a dream. One day you're going to bow down to me. Good one, Joseph. Had a way to win him over. Just call him Powder Puff while you're at it. You know what I'm saying? Then he says, then I had another dream. There was a sun and a moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Good job, Joseph. Now there's really no offense. And his brothers are like, what are you talking about? Look at verse 11. In verse 11, we find something else entering the picture. And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. What's the result of Joseph's dreams? Does his brother say, man, that's awesome that you're going to be a leader and we're going to bow down to you? No. The jealousy goes deeper. God gave Joseph a vision of what would happen, and the work that he would do in Joseph's life, the work that God was going to do in Joseph's life, fueled the jealousy of Joseph's brothers. Thanks, God. When Leslie and I were first married, we lived in a small apartment in Humble. I think it was around 700 square feet or so, six something. And we had like a kitchen / dining room / living room / bedroom. It was that kind of apartment / one sink bathroom. I mean, that's kind of how we lived. And so we lived in that apartment for 2 years and 4 months. And we were able to finally buy a house. And we were so excited about our house. And it was our first home. We were really, really excited. We came across an amazing deal. But I remember the way that Leslie and I felt about that blessing. There was one particular friend that we had in our lives that we just felt we could not be comfortable sharing it with because they were going to be jealous. And we knew it. The moment that we signed the paperwork and this great blessing in our lives that God had brought in our lives, we felt like we couldn't share it with someone because they were going to be jealous. You ever had that happen to you? People look at you, and rather than celebrating what God has done in your life, they look at you with jealousy and they get angry and they get bitter. And that's what's happening to Joseph. God gives Joseph a dream. What an amazing blessing. But rather than responding the right way, his brothers gets jealous. And remember what I said, forgiveness is messy because you can't control the words, thoughts, and actions of other people? No doubt Joseph shared this dream, maybe out of intrigue, or maybe trying to get greater understanding, or maybe even share, look, this is what God has shown me in my life. And the brothers, rather than say, man, that's awesome that God is speaking to you and showing you these things, they get jealous. They get jealous. They go into a fit of rage. And then I want you to notice something in verse 18. They saw him from afar, this being Joseph. And before he came near to them, they conspired against him to what? Kill him. The jealousy has now turned into a plot to murder their own brother. Now notice this. Then they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Here comes Princess Puff. Here comes perfect Princess Dreamer Puff. Here comes the dreamer Joseph, God's and Dad's favorite. And then they said, come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Yeah, we're going to bow down to him. We'll see about that. So one of the brothers, Reuben, talks his brothers out of killing him. But listen to this moment in verse 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. What an image. You've been in that pit before. You've been in that pit of betrayal. When someone pushed you over the edge and you're standing in the pit of betrayal and you're looking up and you see their face peering down at you. You know what that feels like, don't you? You know the hurt. You know the anger and the bitterness and resentment. Someone that you love hurt you and they pushed you into that pit of betrayal. Someone that you trusted violated that trust and they pushed you into that pit of betrayal. Someone that walked out on you, that had promised their life to you, they walked out and they pushed you in that pit of betrayal. Someone picked on you and they bullied you and they pushed you into that pit of betrayal. And there you are in that pit looking up. Do you see the faces of your betrayers? Can't you see them? Can't you see the faces and can't you say the names of the people in your life that have hurt you? The people that you have needed to forgive. But what's so intensely frustrating for me and what's so perplexing about me, and I think for all of us, is that even though we know what it feels like to be pushed into that pit, there have been times in our lives where we're the ones that pushed others into it. And we're the ones standing over the edge of the pit looking at the people that we've betrayed and hurt. Isn't that messy? Isn't that so frustrating? You hate messes and yet your car is messy as well. You see why I say that forgiveness is so messy? That's what happens. We learn this in a very early age when we're in our drug programs at school where they say stay off drugs. They'll tell you that parents who do drugs, their children are more or less likely to do drugs. More. And the kids grow up and they resent their parents for what they had done, yet as their parents push them into that pit of betrayal, they then find themselves doing the exact same thing. Kids who were abused and know what that felt like to be pushed into that pit, they turn around and become abusers themselves. And at the heart of all of this betrayal and standing in that pit or standing on the edge of the pit is that one word that we can all define, but it's so difficult for us to do. It's forgiveness. It's forgiveness. Forgiveness is messy. And here's what I want you to know if you're in the pit today. If you've been hurt, if you've been offended, your response, how you respond to offenses will determine whether you break down or break through. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. The offense in your life as you're in that pit, it's already happened. And the person who did it, you're not responsible for their words, thoughts, or actions. You're responsible for you. And how you respond to offenses in your life is going to determine whether or not you break through or you break down. And here's Joseph in this pit, betrayed by his brothers. He has a decision to make. How am I going to respond to those faces looking down in the pit at me? Here's what breakdown looks like. When I talk about breakdown, I mean anger and resentment and bitterness, grudges, hurt, guardedness, being vengeful, spiteful, being self-destructive, being unforgiving. And the list could go on. That's what breakdown looks like. When we have offenses in our lives, we have to respond to those. You will respond to the offense. You can't just sit there and say, well, I'm not going to think anything. No, you are either going to respond in the right way or the wrong way. And if you respond the wrong way, it's going to lead to anger and resentment and bitterness and on and on. And you'll break down. And you'll repeat cycles. But if you respond in the right way, it can lead to breakthrough. And I want you to know something about Joseph's story. This is kind of letting the cat out of the bag. His is a story of breakthrough. The way he responded determined the outcome. And it's the same for you. Here's my question. When Joseph is in the bottom of that pit, is that God's desire for his life? It is not God's desire for his life. Did God want Joseph's brothers to betray him? Absolutely not. But if Joseph responds in sin, then what's going to happen is he's going to begin pushing people into that pit as well. But if he honors God, even in the midst of his hurt, God can use that and break through in his life. And I want you to see it. Your response to offenses is going to determine what you and others are going to experience. Your response will determine whether you break down or break through, because Joseph's story from this point, it gets way worse. Being thrown in the pit is nothing compared to what's about to happen. In fact, if you look down to verse 28, he's sold as a slave to Midianites. They throw him into the pit, and then some traders come by and they say, hey, let's sell our brother, our own flesh and blood, as a slave. Let's put him on the slave ship, so to speak, and send him away. And that's what they did. So then he ends up in Egypt in verse 36. Those traders then sell him to Potiphar, who is a captain of the guard in Pharaoh's army. In Genesis 39 and verse 4, you'll find that Joseph is then made the overseer of Potiphar's house. And then I want you to see something that happens. Joseph is in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him, likes him. He's a young kid, handsome, and she begins to try to seduce him. She tries to get him to have an affair with her. And notice in verse 7, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me my master has no concern about anything in the house, means he completely trusts me, and he has put everything he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. And notice this question, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against who? God. Not Potiphar, not Potiphar's wife. How can I sin against God? Now I want you to let that sink in for a moment, because that question is the key to whether you experience breakdown or breakthrough when it comes to betrayal. Are you going to go against God? Or are you going to go with Him? I mean, if you're in Joseph's shoes, you think God may have forgotten about you at this point? Your own brother sold you out, sold you as a slave, put you in Potiphar's house. Now Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with you. God's not watching. If He was watching, I wouldn't be a slave in this house. But yet in the midst of this hurt, in the midst of this terrible tragedy, Joseph says, I'm not going to go against God. I'm not going to do this great wickedness. When offenses come, and they are going to come in our lives, when hurt comes, How you respond to those offenses will determine whether that offense breaks you down or helps you break through. Your response to offenses will lead to total breakdown or total breakthrough. A Christ-centered, gospel-centered, grace-driven, forgiving response is what it's going to take for you to break through this betrayal. It's what it's going to take for you to move forward. It's what it's going to take for you, now that you're in Potiphar's house, because of this betrayal that's happened, you have to make a God-honoring decision with your life that I'm going to do things the way that God wants me to do them. Forgiveness is messy, but it gets worse. Joseph, who's now in Potiphar's house, resists this woman's advances. She falsely accuses him of rape, and he's thrown in prison. 13 years. 13 years he suffers because of one act of betrayal. Joseph is only finally released out of prison because while he's in prison, he's able to interpret a dream. And he gets before Pharaoh and he interprets the dream. And then in Genesis chapter 41, we find that when Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he was 30 years old. We find in Genesis 37, when his brothers sold him, he was 17 years old. Some of the best years of his life, 17 to 30. And he's suffering because someone treated him unjustly. Some great hurt in his life. He's in prison, think about it, for a crime he didn't commit. And he was accused of that crime because he was a servant in Potiphar's house, a place he never should have been. But he was there because his brothers sold him as a slave to the Midianites. And he was sold as a slave to the Midianites because his brothers pushed him in a pit and wanted to kill him. So where were you in April of 2002? Think about that. In April of 2002, where were you? I didn't even have kids yet. That's how long we're talking. 13 years of pain going back to one act of betrayal. Sometimes the things that happen to us are going to stay with us for decades. You cannot erase the past. And that's why forgiveness is so messy. And you can't control how other people treat you. That's why forgiveness is so messy. But even though these betrayals and offenses have happened in our lives, it doesn't have to break us down. Have you ever known someone that was betrayed by someone else and it's complete breakdown? They're angry, they're resentful, they're bitter, and they're not saying things like Joseph, I just want to honor God in the midst of this circumstance. No, they're saying, I want revenge. I want to make them pay. Oh, he's going to pay for what he did. She's going to pay for what she did to me. How you respond to offenses is going to determine whether or not you break through or break down. What's God's desire for Joseph's life in prison? It's the very best. He wants the best for Joseph's life. Did God want the best for Joseph while he was in the pit when his brothers pushed him in? You better believe it. Did God want the best for Joseph's life when he was a slave to the Midianites? Yes. There are consequences in our lives to the decisions that sometimes other people make. And sometimes we are dealt a bad hand. Sometimes life is unfair. But in the midst of that pain, we have to make a decision. Will I honor God or am I going to go against Him? Am I going to trust God in the midst of this and keep honoring Him with my life? Or am I going to begin to doubt Him and say, you know what, God, you weren't there for me. I'm going to do things my own way. How you respond to offenses is going to determine the outcome. At the heart of this story is forgiveness. As you're going to see next week, I'm going to tell you that Joseph completely forgives his brothers. And it's an amazing, powerful, moving moment when it happens. And it's much later than this. It's going to be about 30 years after the offense. He's going to be brought face to face with his brothers, and his brothers don't even know it's him. And he has his moment, you know. He can finally exact his revenge that he's been waiting for. And rather than do that, Joseph forgives his brothers. When his brothers sold him as a slave, Joseph didn't let resentment take control. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, here's what he said, I'm not going to sin against God. When Joseph interpreted the dreams, he didn't say, I'm going to do it because God abandoned me. He said, no, God's going to do it. When we start dwelling on how unfair we think God is, or how bad the hand is that we've been dealt, or we begin thinking that God should have done things another way, we ourselves become prisoners of unforgiveness, which leads to bitterness and resentment, anger, and breakdown. But when we keep our minds fixed on God, we can experience breakthrough. I want you to hear what I'm about to say, and I really prayed about this statement. And so I want you to understand that I'm going to try to say this with all the humility and grace that I can, but I believe this to be true with all my heart. If you, as a follower of Jesus, hold unforgiveness in your heart towards someone else, you have sin in your heart. Because the power to forgive doesn't lie in you, does it? Where does it lie? It lies in the power of the cross. And when you crawl up to the bloody cross of Jesus, you have to ask this question: what sin did Jesus die on the cross for, but His blood could not cover it? And the answer is none. It covers all abuse, injustices. It covers every single sin. And if Jesus can forgive us of all of our sins, He can give you the power to overcome that sin in your life of unforgiveness. And I don't say that in a way to condemn you. I don't say that if you hold unforgiveness that there's sin in your heart. I say that to you so that you'll realize what's wrestling inside of you as a believer of Jesus, that's saying you have the right not to forgive, is not the voice of Jesus from the cross saying, Father, forgive them. That one who put the nails in my hand, Father, extend forgiveness to them. Do you see it? Forgiveness is messy, but I'll tell you, it's worth it. I want to leave you with two things to do when you're in the pit of betrayal. The first one is this: even if you don't understand why God would allow the offense, honor God in the middle of the pit. Don't allow unforgiveness to settle in your heart. And I'm going to tell you in this series about what forgiveness is. And you might have faces that are standing above that pit and you just say, I cannot forgive him. Let me tell you something. You can forgive them through the power of the cross. That does not mean that you have to go back to an abuser and say, I'm going to go back and we're going to restore this relationship. I'm not going to say that. That's not what forgiveness is. But forgiveness is you in your heart releasing that person and showing them Jesus on the cross. So in the midst of your hurt, honor God. And the second thing that you should do when you find yourself in the pit of betrayal, don't ask why, but ask how. Because you may not ever know the reason why those offenses came. There are offenses in my life that happened to me when I was a kid that as a grown man with kids of my own, I don't understand them. I don't. And I could drive myself crazy by saying, why? What you should do is say, how? How can God use this in some way to bring someone to the cross of Jesus and find forgiveness for themselves? Betrayal is a difficult pit, but you can have breakthrough. So sometimes I come home and my kids at the house, they want to do things that are messy. Play-Doh makes me crazy. Because when you put the yellow Play-Doh through the French fry smasher, and then your kid wants to follow that up with red, the red and the yellow are going to mix, and then which Play-Doh or container are you going to put it in? Makes me crazy. So I just can't do Play-Doh. And it's all over the ground, it's mashing the carpet, they're eating it, it's just like, why? So not too long ago, my kids asked me, my wife has some paint, they're like, we want to paint. And I'm like, why? Why do you want to paint? Like, let's do something clean. Here's a piece of paper, here's a crayon, and don't write on the wall. We don't like messes, right? So finger painting, for kids, is supposed to be therapeutic. For me, it's like death, you know? And so a couple years ago, my kids came in on Father's Day morning, and they gave me a gift. And, you know, finger painting is very messy, right? It can get very dirty and messy. But this is what Noah made for me in 2011. You see it for Father's Day. And this to you might look like a mess, but it's beautiful to me. You see? In the midst of our hurt, things are going to be messy. But if you'll let God just guide your hand in the midst of the mess, He can take something that's messy and make it beautiful. He can paint a picture that no one else can paint. This is more valuable to me than any Picasso. Now I'd like to have one, right? Don't get me wrong. If you got one, you can give it to me. But I would take this any day over any other artist. Why? Because my Noah made it for me. And God, if you'll just let Him guide you in the midst of that hurt, He can make something beautiful of the mess of betrayal that you've experienced, okay? And I want to encourage you, come back next week. We're going to resolve this message. I know this message kind of leaves us unresolved, but next week we're going to read the rest of the story of Joseph and his brothers. And it's amazing what happens. So I want to pray. I want to pray for you and pray with you. Will you join me in prayer? God, we've all been betrayed. We've experienced it. Man, we know, God, what those faces look like, and we know the hurt. We know what the shove into the pit felt like. And there may be some that even just hearing it today, it's kind of opened up some wounds. And that's not my intent, God. That's not my desire. My desire is that those wounds can be healed. And I know that's your desire as well. That you want us to forgive others in the same way that Christ forgave us. Help us to understand that forgiveness is going to be messy. There are going to be things that they're just unfair. And at the end of the day, we're going to get the short end of the stick, so to speak, in terms of human justice. But help us to trust you in the midst of our pain, that when we're in the bottom of that pit of betrayal, we would decide, even sitting here today, God, I'm going to honor you. I don't know how I'm going to forgive. I don't want to forgive. In fact, I want to stay unforgiving. But God, today we pray that you will help us forgive. In the cross, we find that power, Lord, to forgive. And so I pray that even now, through the message today and the series over the next couple of weeks, that those who are struggling with unforgiveness, who have maybe turned angry and bitter and resentful, will be set free. Not because of a message series, but because they realize that the power to forgive lies in the power of the cross. So for those who are hurting today, I pray that you'll give them peace, that you will begin even now to bring healing to their lives. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.